So welcome everybody. My name is JL Needham. I'm in content partnerships where I work with a variety of Googlers on government content and working with governments, and it's in this context that I bumped into Tom Steinberg, who I'll be introducing today. Before I do though, a word from our sponsors, which is sort of appropriate where we're talking about public content to have a public broadcast-like sponsor here. Google's elections team, as you probably know, we're doing a number of interesting things this election cycle in the US. You've certainly seen You Choose and the debates, and perhaps the Google Australia elections launch during the recent election there. We're seeking engineers on 20% time to help us solve some interesting problems with search and geo and gadgets. So if you're an engineer and have that time, let me know. Again, JL Needham, and I'll hook you up with the team. So Tom Steinberg, to read from his official bio, is founder and director of MySociety in the UK, which is a charitable body that runs a number of quite important websites in the public commons there in the UK, including writetothem.com, pledgebank.com, and others. The missions of MySociety are to build websites which give people simple, tangible benefits in the democratic and community aspects of their lives, and which teach the public and voluntary sector, including those of us at Google, which have been monitoring the success of MySociety, how they can use technology to better help citizens. By trade, Tom was a policy analyst and general wonk who mainly cut his teeth at the Prime Minister's strategy unit. He'll, of course, be introducing us to the activities of MySociety and his background. What's most notable about Tom, for me, is the report that he was commissioned to write with a colleague entitled The Power of Information. This is in the UK context, a report that stirred a lot of interest, not only among e-activists, myself and others in that community, but also government managers who I think have a respect for Tom's constructive approach, and I think you'll find that in his remarks. Tom.
Oh, it's so nice to be called constructive rather than a troublemaking cyber anarchist. So thank you very much, Del. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here today. I think it's probably worth starting with just a tiny bit of audience participation, especially since this is a public policy talk, so I'm guessing that those of you here are probably in some ways interested in the democratic, the policy, the government sort of world, at least a bit. Who here is not on Facebook? Oh, wow. This is really good. Though you guys, you still have a chance of a political career. Well done. The rest of you, it's already too late. Sorry. So what is MySociety? As Jel just mentioned, we have these missions that are very kind of clear and very official. The main one of which is to build websites that give citizens simple, tangible benefits in the community, the democratic spheres of their lives. But that really is a bit highfalutin. I think a better kind of description is to focus on tangible there, just the word tangible, because what MySociety is all about is building sites that people use, and when they use them, when they finish using them, there's something a little bit different about their life. Just in the way as when you go to Amazon, for example, and you order a book, there is really something very tangible at the end of the day. There is a book. And this may seem like a funny word to focus on, but in the realm of campaigning and democracy and the internet, all too often people's goals are a little bit nebulous. Read this and you'll sort of be a slightly better person, or you'll be better informed. MySociety has quite a hard edge. We try and do things that do one thing and do it well. Another way of describing what MySociety is it's these people. This is MySociety on a retreat, or most of it, earlier this year. We're a virtual organization, so we don't get together very often, and occasionally we have weekend retreats. About 2/3 of the people you can see here are volunteers, and maybe what this shows, and the general dress code, is that it's a kind of coder-driven organization, even though it's in the political democratic universe. It's an open source organization. Everything we produce is in open source. Under the Affero GPL, if you're that interested. But that describes really vaguely what we do. What do we really specifically do? Well, look, we run things like this. This is writetothem.com. Hopefully, you can work out what writetothem.com does in about 2 seconds. If you can't tell what it does, then we've made it too hard to use. Basically, a user puts in their postcode, their zip code equivalent, and it tells them who all their politicians are, no matter how local they are, or how national, or in the case of Europe, even international they are. this may not seem like rocket science, but it's notable to me, I think, really interestingly, that in the US, you know, the most technologically advanced society in the world, the largest, most kind of passionate democracy, you still don't have a site that will tell you all your representatives, no matter where you live. It's an interesting omission, and maybe one that could be of interest to an organization who is interested in getting all of the world's knowledge into one place. When people use this, we don't just tell them who their politicians are, we let them write to those politicians. That is not really a very sophisticated process. We still send faxes to some politicians because some of them don't actually even use email these days. This is definitely the only website in the world to have a "Give me a random lord" button. That's the button you press if you don't know which lord to write to, and you just decide you want one arbitrarily. What does this very, very simple site do? It almost seems kind of insultingly simple to show to people with your kind of experience. Well, firstly, it works for people who don't know who their politicians already are. And that turns out to be a lot of people. For members of parliament, who are the best known class of politician in the UK, so about 40% of the population actually knows who their own member of parliament is correctly. And I imagine that's probably not entirely dissimilar to the rates that you get here for senators and congressmen. So building a site that just that shows up and it answers people's questions when they go to Google and they type in, "Who is my politician? I have a problem. How do I write to them?" But when they can't name them, actually sort of plugs an important gap. The other thing that this site does is that, a little bit like Amazon with its people who bought this, bought that, this site gathers information for one purpose that gets used for another. And I'll give you an example of how that works in a moment. Let me show you for a slightly more kind of complicated site that we run. This isn't it. This is ugly. What this is the record of what is said in Parliament. This is how it's published at the moment. It's pretty much as simple as it could be. It's a very broken HTML. What is said in Parliament, like what is said in Congress, is pretty important in many ways. So what the gang of volunteers who came together around this project did a few years ago is they built parsers and scrapers, and they sat down, and what they ended up doing was building a system that could turn this into this. This is theyworkforyou.com. And this is the same debate. That's actually exactly the same text that you've just seen on the two slides there. The big difference here is that obviously not only does it have some basic usability about line lengths and spacing, it makes it more personal. You can see who the person is and what kind of job they have. It's a little bit social. You can see somebody over on the right-hand side has left a comment. It's also more searchable for obvious reasons. So They Work For You started as really only having the ambition to make that public record much easier to read, much more easy to understand. But weirdly, in the way that some good internet projects start up doing one thing and end up doing another, what it really became about was these pages. This is an example of an MP page on They Work For You. This is the one for the Prime Minister at the moment, and it draws together loads of information and services from different places. So you've got the real basics there. What was their majority in the election? If we look on, you can see that it brings together information on how they voted and makes it very, very simple to understand. So there might be 10 votes that are really complicated on some issue, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that this MP voted strongly for introducing ID cards, or this MP never rebels against their own party, or that sort of fairly simple kind of conclusion. They Work For You is pretty much the most popular site that we run. And what's interesting about it is that it doesn't really bring a whole lot of new information into the world. There's really one exception. In the middle there it says, replied within 2 or 3 weeks to a medium number of messages sent via Write to Them. That Write to Them is the site that I just showed you. We survey everybody who writes to their politicians, and we find out whether they say they got an answer. And guess what? Some people are really good at giving answers, and some people aren't. And when you publish it, that sort of matters. But most of this information here has been available for many, many years. But there is the difference between information that is theoretically available about your politicians and information that is there when you type their name into Google and press go, and it turns up in the first couple of search rankings. So what does this show? Why does this matter? Well, one, it just shows the power of representing information. Sorry, yeah, quick question.
The U.S. has a huge influence.
Yeah.
How does that sort of
Okay, that won't have come out. So I'll ask, how do we know whether the scorecard that we've just shown you is neutral? We encourage different people from different parts of the political spectrum to make those different scorecards, and then we try and just pick the ones that represent the biggest, most controversial issues in the last few years. What's a little bit frustrating about the UK situation is we don't actually have the richness of NGOs who go fighting for that. It would be great if we had more arguments, because then we would have people vetting this information more. But largely, we have to do a lot of it ourselves. But to just keep going, one thing it shows then is that just take and represent information and make it really easy to read, and it will sort of start to have impacts that really seem a bit silly. For example, this information here says how much people show up to vote. And after this site had been running for a couple of years, we started to hear rumors, and then claims appeared in the newspapers that politicians were turning up to vote in votes they didn't care about. They were turning up to make speeches that they didn't care about, so that their rankings on this website would go up. That's rather not only silly but almost dangerous, and we changed the way we publish statistics at that point to try and lower that incentive. But much more positively, the survey information I just showed you about how good people are at writing back to their politicians, we know that this has a positive impact on motivating politicians to get better. And probably the best example of this recent times was a politician who wrote to us and said, "My rating is very bad for my responsiveness, and this can't possibly be right. I'm very good. My office is extremely good at writing back to their mail." So we went and we looked really closely to make sure there was nothing amiss. And we wrote back and we said, "No, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong. Maybe you should go and look at your office. Maybe you should go and ask around and dig and find out if there's anything going on." And a couple of days later, we got an email from this guy, straight from the MP himself, that just said one thing. It said, "Yep, looks like I was talking shite." So we know that producing this information and just making it easy to get and making it rise up the Google rankings has an impact on how politicians see themselves and see their jobs. It also, interestingly, from a slightly technical perspective, shows the enduring power of email. So one of the most popular services on this site is for people to say, "I want to be mailed whenever my politician speaks, or whenever any politician mentions something that I am interested in." So if you worked in a company like this, you could say, "Please mail me whenever anyone mentions Google," whoever they are. And that, these days, sends out more custom emails on an average day than people actually come and visit the site. Now, in an era where we're all supposed to be very interested in syndication, this website has an API, it has RSS, but there is something of enduring power about email alerts, as if any of you work on the Google News alerts probably know. It's just worth sort of repeating that. But lastly, to say how it's sort of generally bedding down in the political landscape of the UK. It's interesting that we have an email alert that sends us an email collectively as an organisation whenever anybody mentions they work for you in Parliament. And we got this brilliant email a few weeks ago that read the following way. It was a debate about family policy. And it was a lady called Anne Snellgrove. And so she was standing in Parliament and she said, "I have been happily married, I am glad to say, for 29 years. As my husband subscribes to They Work For You email alerts, I'm just giving him notice that it will be our 30th anniversary next year." So you might think that this sort of work would just get you in trouble with government, would make them really sort of resent and dislike and not really want anything to do with you. But there was a pretty big surprise, which is that last year we got approached by the Office of the Prime Minister, which in the UK is a civil service, it's a non-partisan thing. And they said, "Will you build us a petitions website?" And we did. It was a very interesting experience because we were a little bit kind of shy. We didn't necessarily just want to do this because they have, an amazing brand, We demanded really strong privacy measures. All the information about all the signers belongs to MySociety, not to Number 10. The government can write back up to twice to any petition. It can email people directly, which it could never afford to do in the era when it was paper. But they don't own that information. If you submit a petition here and the government rejects it, the rejection appears on a special section of the site. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never been to another website where moderation appears and says these things have been rejected for these reasons. But it was very important for us that this was essentially a very trustworthy thing. So, what happened? Well, it launched. It's just over a year old, and now there are about 6 million signatures from about 4 million people. Now, that's about 6–7% of the UK population at this point, which makes it pretty much, well, by some distance, the biggest kind of democracy internet project that's really ever happened in the UK of that kind. It created a great fuss with one enormous petition in particular about congestion charging, and it's created a bit of controversy because the government didn't change the nature of what a petition was. Petitions don't have much legal status in the UK. You're allowed to petition them, but you don't get any rights. They're not like putting propositions on the ballot here in California. But that said, 1.8 million people did sign a petition about congestion charging, and that was back in February. And a few days ago, this headline came up. So make of that what you will. I imagine the government probably would claim there wasn't a connection between the two things. But this makes us seem like MySociety is really all about kind of politicians. But actually, we believe that democracy and the internet is about more than that. It's not just about elections, it's not just about the people who stand up there. It's about the health of our communities, of our civil society, those things that work in between elections to get things done, to get things changed, to make things work. And we run a couple of different sites that operate in this field. One of them is pledgebank.com, and my colleague Heather here actually works in the US doing outreach on this website. PledgeBank is about building peer pressure in communities. It's about that sort of tangible push to get things done. And what it lets people do is it makes pledges which are always of the same quite hard form. They say, I will do something, but only if some other people will do it. And then it actually surveys them to go and see if they did. And if they don't get enough, if you don't get enough signers, the pledge fails, and everybody gets told that they failed. And that may seem like a little bit negative, especially to the NGO community that always likes to be really, really positive. But there's something quite hard-edged about a pledge that really succeeds. That's why this mailing list in Brixton here, this got set up. It exists. And on a bigger scale, this pledge relates to creating a new group like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In the UK, for a very long time, people complained, why is there no Electronic Frontier Foundation in the UK? We care about these issues too. And the answer was because there was never a rich person to just drop the money on it. So they used PledgeBank to say, right, well, none of us are that rich, but I will give £5 a month every month automatically, but only if 1,000 other people will. And this is now a real organisation. I know it's real because I share their offices. And that's the sort of that's just one example of the sort of community building thing that MySociety does. This is a totally different example of something which is not essentially political, but is still about democracy. FixMyStreet is a site for fixing your street. Again, hopefully it's obvious enough what it does. You stick in your postcode, your zip code, your street name, whatever it is. It gives you a map. You stick a pin in that map, and it reports it to your local government, wherever you live in the UK. There are 470 different local governments in the UK. It works out which one it is. It sends it to the right place. And again, it checks. It mails you a few weeks later to find out, did it get fixed? And it opens up that process whereby, normally you complain, your complaint sort of disappears into a black hole. Did anyone else complain? I don't know. And it blows open that process. And like a lot of what MySociety does, there's a hidden agenda here, which is that we build services that very often seem to be about me. They seem to be about, I need something fixing in my life. I have to write to my politician because I have a problem in my life. I have to get this because someone has burnt a car outside my house and it's smouldering. But everything MySociety does gives people those really simple, almost consumer-like services, and then tries to, by a slightly hidden mechanism, make them realize that they're actually part of a bigger thing. They're part of a community. They're part of a democracy. So, for example, if you say, no, my problem didn't get fixed when you get surveyed, we help you write to your councillors, your local politicians, straight away. So we hook you up on that little step. And there's a pattern here, which is, we build what we think of, or what we call escalation paths. I've got a picture of a ski lift here because I can't think of a better mechanism. And what I mean by escalation paths is that if you can get people in at the very, very easiest end of democratic engagement, things where you're not standing up saying, you should be democratic and political because it's very good and some people you never met died in some war a long time ago. If you can say, here's a service, and then you can explain to them that this is not like a company, this is part of the democracy and you're kind of in charge, and here's how to take a really simple next step, then I think you can get systematically a lot more people engaged, educated, involved, and empowered in their democracy. And I've just shown you kind of one very simple example there. We do another one with Write to Them. So people finish writing to their politician, and we say, thank you, well done. And we need to say thank you because half of these people have never written to a politician in their life before. This is quite a big step. And we then say, would you like a long-term relationship with your politician? And yes, we say that because it sounds a little bit smutty, but that's part of the way of getting them click. And what happens is about 25% conversion rate we get going through to this thing, which is called Hear from Your MP. Hear from Your MP builds an email list for every MP in the country and then writes to the MP and says there are 50 people, there are 100 people, there are 200 people who want to hear from you. And the politician gets a chance to write to them with one really important caveat, which is that there is a public discussion forum for what they say. So they can't just use this to spam, because if they send spam, people will just mock them. Now, what's remarkable about this site, it's really still quite a small little site. It's only got like 50,000 signers. 145 out of the 600 plus politicians in the UK have already sent at least one message through this, despite the fact that when they do this, they do open themselves up for the possibility that people will not only engage in debate, but might be hostile. But it's a way of introducing them to the idea that the internet era is more interactive than the previous era. And the question they should not ask about the internet era of politics is, how do I broadcast? How do I do like TV over the internet? The question is, how do I become genuinely interactive? So I want to finish up by talking about some of the opportunities and the challenges that I see as kind of existing in this era of kind of non-partisan democratic websites. And in particular, some of the challenges which I think that the mighty brains here assembled might have some interesting views on. If I press the right key. I just said that we get a really good conversion rate from people using our services and then going on to sign up to things that engage them in the future. In the UK, there's about 60 million people in the UK, from about 30 million in the labour force. Last year, 9 million of those people went online in the UK and they registered to pay their car tax, which they have to do to have a car. Now, at the end of those 9 million transactional processes where people gave the money, the government said, thank you for your money, goodbye. And that to me is an enormous wasted opportunity. The great opportunity there is to say, hey, this thing that you just paid your tax to, this is not, again, this is not like a normal business. You have some say in this. And the opportunity is to put 9 million people towards some form of sustained engagement. Something that might be very simple, something that might be a bit more challenging, but something. At the moment, there is nothing. The government, or rather number 10, can write back to all those petitions, and it has done. It has sent something like 800 replies, which have gone to something like 3 million citizens at the moment, responding about their petition. In each case, the citizen has got a view back from the government, which they, to be honest, would never have done before. It's a step forward. Previously, you sign a petition, you wait, maybe a year later you read about it in the newspapers, maybe you don't. Surely the big opportunity here is not just to get an email that says, here's why the government doesn't agree with you, but it's to get a mail that says, hey, you know, why don't we really in some way talk about this thing? Why don't we really tell you more about your area? Why don't we give you opportunities to be involved in the democracy that you live in some way? And that is a thing that I'm trying to persuade bits of government in the UK to start doing. And it's one that I think could be very interesting in America as well. There's one really big challenge here. Some people said to us, why doesn't the petition site have discussion forums? That would seem really obvious. Then people could sign a petition and they could talk about it. I think the fairly simple answer is that there have been 13,000 live petitions with up to 1.8 million people on them. The 50th biggest, if you arrange them in order of size, has 5,000 people on them. If you can imagine the quality of debate you're likely to get if you just shove people into a pre-existing kind of off-the-shelf discussion forum, it's going to make the worst blog comment thread you've ever read in your life look like kind of plain English and common sense. The big hard problem here is can you have big-scale deliberation? Is it actually possible? I think a lot of us have sort of given up because you go to really busy sites, it just seems like it can't be done. But I think it partly can't be done because people have never really tried. People have never tried to say, can we get the best 1% of ideas out of a group of 10,000 people discussing something online. Now, if we have things like these petitions going to enormous numbers of people, or if we have enormous numbers of people paying their tax and then being asked to go and talk about how that tax is paid, we can get the numbers, we can get the traffic. That is no longer a question. The question is, can we get anything meaningful out of what they say? And can that be bubbled up? Could it be can the wheat be separated from the chaff and the ideas bubbled up to the top? The second big hard problem, intriguingly, is what happens after your next election. Now, I was made to think about this particularly hard. We changed prime ministers this year, and about 10 days before the new prime minister, Gordon Brown, came in, I was sitting on a bus in North London when I got phoned by him. I had to get off the bus. And what he wanted to talk about for a slightly terrifying kind of 10, 15 minutes was, so all this democracy and internet stuff, can we have big debates? That was actually a question he said. Can you have a big debate on something like the smoking ban that's just come into place in the UK? He asked a series of really hard questions basically about what next. What if the government decides it's not afraid of these things? What if it decides that actually it sees this as a way of improving democracy, improving legitimacy, improving public services in a way that it never could before? Who's it going to phone? Now, the Blair-Bush kind of duo, one thing that they have in common, which is not very much talked about, is that they are the last global leaders of the pre-internet era, the last global leaders who themselves basically didn't use computers at all. And that whoever wins next time, unless they're exceptionally regressive, is going to be someone who's been doing a lot of their own mail for the last few years, who's developed probably reasonably sophisticated views over what counts a good or bad website. When you had Barack Obama here a few weeks ago, he was talking about what he would do, which sites he would build. But these are actually quite hard questions. How would you really build a site that would allow people to drill into any federal contract? That's a lot of information. How do you encourage the different bits of government to publish the information in the right formats? What do you do? What do you do once you have got that information? How do you build compelling services that anyone actually wants to go and use? The reason I say this is the day after here is because they're going to phone people like you, just in the way that they phone somebody like me. And I would like you not to be caught on the bus. I'm saying this to more or less everybody I know who works in the kind of political internet sphere at all in the US. Now is the time to be saying, what is the genuinely huge project that only the government can do in conjunction with people on the outside about public information, public services in America? Because if you have the good idea on the right day and it's packaged in the right way, it might be the first thing that the president signs off. After all, when new leaders come in, one of the things they normally want to do is make a specific break from the past, and in particular, if the previous administration is seen in any way as having been closed or seedy a bit, or in other ways, in other forms, kind of difficult and obscure, then looking for policies that say, here is how we are going to change the way that the government works itself. Not how we're going to change healthcare, but here's how we're going to change the way we do everything, is going to be on the table on the first day. That is what happened in the UK. One of the very last things to say is, as a tiny little NGO, one of the problems is money. That's not so much your problem. That's sort of one of the reasons I'm in Silicon Valley. Well, what can I say other than it's Christmas? So I thought I wouldn't lay that on too thick. Lastly, really, I just want to show you this kind of picture again. Because the thing that I really love about this photo is how kind of cheerful the gang look. Now, that might be possibly because some of them have been drinking, doubtless the guy with the whiskey bottle actually in his mouth. But I like to think that there's more to it than that. Working for MySociety makes me happy because I can't think of a way that so few people could help so many other people to understand and get things done in their democracy, in the UK at least. But we're right at the start of the journey of doing more of that, a journey which I believe can transform what it means to live in our democracy, at least, transform it for the better. And I think it can transform it in ways that we haven't yet imagined, really, and in particular ways that are not just good for us, but good for people who live in countries which are not democratic and where our problems with our democracy right now leave leaders with excuses to suggest that maybe maybe the very validity of people living in freedom is actually not such a great idea in the first place. I think that's partly why we have not just a need but a real duty to think how this sort of technology can make our own democracies and our own governments more accountable. It's going to be a really interesting journey, and I hope very much that some of you can come along for the ride. Thank you.
Hello. So Tom is now ours to take questions or to pose questions. And I'll start off with a two-part question. And then when we get the discussion going, please either use the microphone or Tom, if you'll just repeat the question for the recording. So part one, about countries with weaker democratic institutions and these tools, these ideas that you've been applying in the UK. Do you see any examples of your counterparts emerging in, say, Eastern Europe or Asia? And do you have any communication with those parties? And then part two, this public works repair site, what is fly tipping?
Okay. I'll answer that in the reverse. Fly tipping is just when somebody drops garbage where they're not supposed to. I don't know. Does that have an equivalent?
Not necessarily. No.
Okay. In fact, we've had some great examples of that, like somebody dumping a piano, someone dumping an enormous pile of mozzarella as well. You get all sorts of things. Yes, we have found some. We have met some people from kind of newer democracies. It's actually a big difference here between non-democracies and new democracies. Non-democracies building this sort of thing and running it is very dangerous. But earlier this summer, we met. We had a little unconference with just about 20 people in Berlin, where the whole goal was, let's get the people who actually run this sort of site across Europe, rather than the sort of people who theorize, together in one room. And it was particularly good because the room it happened to be in was in the basement of Erich Honecker's old office. That's the former kind of dictator of East Germany. So it felt particularly good to be in there, kind of being subversive. One thing that is interesting about some of the new democracies is they are bold about this stuff in a way that we're not. So you know, I said that we changed the way we publish our statistics to reduce kind of perverse incentives. Well, in places like Romania, we see things like them suing the parliament under freedom of information to get the mobile phone numbers of all the politicians, and then winning, and then putting them all online, and then building an SMS service so that you can send your politician SMS from the web at any point. I mean, things that make us just go, whoa, kind of hold back there. So yeah, there are some good examples, and in the US here, you have the Sunlight Foundation, which was started about 18 months ago, partly inspired by the work MySociety has done, working both to build their own sites and to help existing organizations that have been there gathering information, for example, on lobbying for many, many years in Washington, but who are completely pre-web in their outlook, and they're helping. They give them money and say things like, this is just to put your database online in a fashion that other databases can query. So it is starting to happen here. But it is really intriguing that in the US, you are way, way, way ahead on terms of very, very partisan uses of the political internet. You raise astonishing amounts of money in incredibly small amounts of time, and I have massive respect for the people who have the skills for doing that. But it is, as I said, really intriguing that there isn't a single website in America where no matter where you live, you can go and find out who your politicians are. And I think that's a very exciting gap. I would see that as a big opportunity. When we went along and filled that gap in the UK, it led to all sorts of fun like being here today.
Hi, can you hear me? So the sites you described, they seem to be like one-offs. Do you plan to extend this like a platform that that you can use this as a platform to build a similar kind of applications for like in the US or something like that? Do you have that in your plans or not?
We don't have the goal of, for example, packaging these up so that you can deploy them really easily on your own server, because these things are not like email clients. They need a lot of customization. Each country has such a different democracy that's very difficult. However, it's all available in our CVS repository. It's all there to be reused. And if people come and ask questions, we'll definitely help explain to them. And we also actually will even work for people sometimes if they can give us some money.
Thanks. Wanted to follow up a little bit on your reference to the California proposition system. One of the experiences, I think, is that ironically, that system is sometimes perceived as having made less successful democracy. That is, essentially it operates to undermine accountability and things with regard to the elected officials, partly through financing and also interest group takeover. And if you could talk a little bit about your sense of the potential for something like this to be taken over and essentially used by interest groups with the effect of reproducing the kind of paralysis that one sees oftentimes with interest groups taking over participation rather than having it lead to what would seem to be a more productive democracy.
So, kind of democratic theorists will normally talk about like there being two broad sorts of democracy: direct democracy and representative. And direct is basically like what happens at a general election, where the majority wins and that's it. And representative is where you have a set of politicians and they listen to the people, but then they make the decisions themselves ultimately. MySociety actually is very much an organization that supports representative democracy, it's not as was expected in the very, very early days of when people were talking about the internet and democracy. The expectation was that we'd just do everything direct because, hey, now you don't need politicians because you can sit at home and decide how much to spend on that bridge or that this government program. I think that I haven't seen many applications that have actually specifically undermined the representative process in that way, made it more direct. But I do think that you could, especially if you have relatively unscrupulous populist governments, they might try and solicit kind of very dumb plebiscites and get people very emotive to sign things that would then sort of just be very, very direct, unthought through mandates, maybe persecuting minorities. However, I think the real potential here is to make the representative system we've got work just much, much better than it works at the moment. A representative system can only work when the politicians have loads of good information, when they listen really intently to the people, and when the people can get to them and say, you don't want to listen to me today, but this is really, really important that you do. And I think that is what we try and do more of, is that. And also what we will be doing in the future as we build a big freedom of information site, for example, is going to those bits of government that are not elected but make loads of important decisions anyway, and say, we need to shine the light there as well.
My question sort of complements the previous question. If the endeavor like yours is replicated somewhere else, say in Europe or in maybe less democratic scenario, do you think it might provide an excuse for the government to actually bloat the bureaucracy to manage the queries and petitions and whatnot, and as a result will become abused from the government's end?
I suppose it was a concern that our own government might not use the petitions in an entirely kind of right or good way that meant that we negotiated this very unusual design with them. So yes, every tool that has ever been invented can be used for all sorts of good and bad reasons. That's sort of a cliche. I think that we will indeed have to watch out for regimes that take what appear to be really good democratic systems and actually do things, dress up basically abuses of power under those. But I think one of the best ways of making sure that it doesn't happen here is for those of us capable of doing this, capable of building these sorts of sites, capable of designing them, is that we talk to our own governments about what makes good and what makes bad, so that they can understand that there's a very fine line maybe between a really, really useful, really, really sort of moral system and one which is really, really dubious. If you leave that maybe just to the governments to guess themselves, they probably simply won't have the skill to tell the difference. So there's sort of a duty upon those of us who understand the technology and the privacy implications and the abuse implications to be on the lookout for that sort of thing.
Hi, I was just going to ask, what kinds of impacts have the increased transparency of the newsletter services that MySociety is providing to all these elected officials had? For instance, is the fact that so many people are reading these newsletters now changing the messages that these electeds are presenting and making them perhaps more oblique and less honest and kind of even more on message than in the past?
To be honest, there's so many of them that it's a little bit difficult to tell. People sometimes ask me the same sort of questions about the petitions and their responses. We are commissioning an evaluation of all our different sites at the moment, precisely to go and look at this. But I can't say offhand. Bear in mind that a lot of politicians also maintain their own mailing lists here as well. But of course, if you're on the politician's own mailing list, you probably don't get a chance or a space to discuss things with them. So.
On one of your slides, you made reference to how many times Gordon Brown had used 3-word alliterative phrases, and it said, "Why is this here?" And I was wondering why that was there.
Okay, so that is there so that you click on the link that says, "Why is this here?" And when you do click on that link, it says, "This is to show you that statistics can be true, literally kind of correct factually, and they can still hide and confuse and dissemble." And it's a warning to make you think about all the other statistics on this website, because we know that if we just write a caveat that says, please be aware, these are just statistics, and just because this person never shows up to vote, that might be because they were ill or something, or that might not even be a bad thing. They might be doing other good work. It makes you think about it. If we just had a caveat, because of those of you here who use usability, you know that no one will read the caveat. That people literally won't even see the words. They will just see the numbers. Make something weird like that, people go and read it. It's a usability hack, basically.
Can you tell us a little bit about the early days, how you managed to create an audience for the sites? And for example, in the write-to-them.com domain, I will imagine that you didn't have all the contacts with all the politicians in the beginning. So did you first open the website, receive this, and then run around looking for these politicians' contacts, or how did it start?
Yeah, so Write to Them started as a website called Fax Your MP in 2000, entirely built and run by volunteers before MySociety existed as a charity. It did indeed send mostly faxes in those days, because they mostly didn't have email. In fact, it did some really dubious things with it would change the fonts and the layout of each fax so that it wouldn't look like we were all coming from the same service. How did it grow? Well, partly it grew because they told some people who ran campaigns about it. But the big reason it grew is because by about a year or two in, you look for MP, just the word MP, and it was pretty much the first thing to come up in any search engine. Almost everything we do relies on search engine traffic because we are too poor to buy any marketing. It's an acceptable way of living these days. They Work For You will have millions of visitors this year because of that. And what can we say? Thank you very much.
I'm just curious if Stormont is included in, like Northern Irish and Scottish parliaments are included in what MySociety does?
Last Christmas, just before he went on holiday, one of our core developers sent a surprise mail saying he'd added the Northern Irish Parliament Assembly to They Work For You, just without telling anybody. So that is indeed included there. We would love to bundle in all the local governments. As I said, there are 400 local governments, but here you get into a classic screen scraping problem. They all publish them in 400 different formats. In some ways, one of the best things about doing a site like this is if you've ever been in a really fruitless argument with somebody about why they should bother publishing things in standardized formats, here is a really, really lovely example, or several different nice examples of the real value. I said that They Work For You sent more email every day than people who actually came and visited the site. When you tell a politician like how many people are getting mail every time they just literally open their mouth, then they can come to understand. You can say that can only happen because we take this terrible, terrible HTML and make it into nice data. Then that's a real way of explaining to people why nice data matters.
I really like the pledge bank idea. I mentioned something similar to this to a friend, and they said something like, I'm sure you could do it, but you'd probably be put in jail by the government. And I'm glad to see that somebody's built it and nobody's been sent to jail yet, but I'm curious if you could tell us more about how it's doing and what obstacles remain so that it hasn't, in order to foment all sorts of mischievous acts or positive revolutions, because it seems like a very powerful tool.
Pledge Bank runs in 13 different languages because loads of people made pledges that said, I will translate 10% of the text in this, but only if 9 other people in my country will. So it runs, considering it's a really small site, it runs in a ridiculous number of different languages. And we can't even necessarily tell how well it's doing. Like, probably in the last year, the most popular site it was in the Ukraine, and of course we couldn't even read most of those. Heather here really is the person to talk to about how to make it grow. The Omidyar Network, which is one of the big foundations here in California, actually said, we really like Pledge Bank. We want it to succeed in America. What can we do? And we said, actually, what you can do is help employ somebody who will go and talk to campaign groups, NGOs, to explain how it works. The big challenge, the thing that makes Pledge Bank a difficult site, is that idea of conditional pledging, the fact that it can fail. That's like a bit scary in some ways. It's both why it's powerful and why it's a little bit difficult to explain. And so I think if there's any reason why it hasn't gone kind of spontaneously virally enormous, that's it. But I think within the political context here, the Ron Paul campaign, for some reason, they've got loads of pledges on there, but none of the other campaigns. Who knows why? So.
Yeah, you mentioned the problem of trying to refine massive online debates. Have you had any luck solving that problem? I've seen sites attempt that, and some do it better than others, but that is a worthwhile goal.
Yeah, my view on this is that it's an expensive problem to fix, or to have a go at fixing, because you need to do loads of really good user testing. Nearly everything that you see here, the most expensive site you're looking at is well under $100,000 of development. And I think what I've been telling people in the government, for example, is I think they probably need to budget starting at about $1 million to run experiments in this field, because you just need, it's just such a hard UI problem. That's why we've never actually had a go, because as a small organization with really limited resources, you pick projects you think you can do really well. You don't pick projects you think you can do really badly. I would love to have a go, and I have some theories about maybe the right angles to take. I think almost the most important one is if you've got 10,000 people, you probably need to break that into 1,000 groups of 10 people. But in terms of actual delivery, no, we haven't even had a shot. I would love to know about examples people have seen. I'd love to know about anyone who knows about companies that are working on that problem.
So in part of trying to get the debate shaped, how do you keep people from just asking for more and more and more, and help them to see the priorities and why things may not be, maybe you want to eliminate the car tax, and of course if you surveyed the people, and who would say no, I don't want to pay the car tax, yeah. And then but it's there's always a consequence of not doing that. So
that's when I kept saying this. I think that seizing on online services that are provided by government, like claiming benefits or paying tax, a really good way of explaining this is not like a business, this is different, is precisely because you can explain the concept of the compromise. Maybe one of the very best things the Petitions has ever done is when they sent the one email that went to 1.8 million people, let me tell you, that's a nerve-wracking thing to do, to send a mail from 2 million people from the Prime Minister. That mail said why the government didn't necessarily agree with what a lot of the people had said. Now, I think that is one step forward on that road, is to get quite a detailed thing that has not been filtered through the eyes of the media. The next step, surely, is some sort of bigger deliberative platform that says, here are various different bits of evidence, here is what people say about them. Again, I don't have the right answer. I think it's an expensive project, but really, I think it's one worth tackling, because if we can tackle this, if we can actually get substantial proportions of the whole population, and by substantial proportions I mean 1%, engaging on, say, some big policy issue and feeling like maybe they've been listened to, or even feeling like they were listened to and then their ideas were challenged and they changed their minds some, we can change the political climate of whole countries that way, I believe. But it's just not easy.
So while you're contemplating a Christmas gift to MySociety, let me reiterate that if you'd like to work on this area as part of your day job, the elections team welcomes engineers on 20% time, interesting problems we're working on. And let me thank Jake Hubert and the public policy team for welcoming Tom's visit and arranging today's policy talk. And thanks to Tom.